Eliza Orzeszkowa, the Argonauts. Thanks to your subscription, the channel can grow. Chapter 3. Malvina Darvid was one of those women to whom old age is very tardy in coming, and whose beauty, modified in each season of life, never leaves them. For this last, she was indebted less to the features of her face than to the immense charm of her movements, her smile, her expression, her speech. She retained yet the same pale golden hair which she had years earlier, which she arranged high above her low forehead, calling to mind the statues of Grecian women. In contrast with that hair, and her slightly faded but delicate complexion, shone, from under dark brows, large eyes, also dark, with a very mild, warm expression, now bright, now tempered by a deep inevitable cloud of pensiveness. In a robe covered with lace, in the glitter of a star of diamonds in the bright aureole of her hair, she greeted the numerous acquaintances who entered her box at the theater, with the affability and freedom of a perfect society lady. She was even celebrated in that great city for the qualities which constitute so-called society personages, and which, in those who knew her past, roused a certain wonder. It was known to all that that past was very modest. Darvid in his youth, which was far less brilliant than his present, married a poor orphan, a teacher. But Malvina Darvid was of those women who need only a golden setting to sparkle like diamonds. She shone in the great world with a charm, an elegance, a power of speech which were the same as if she had been its own daughter. She was radiant with satisfaction, with serenity, often even with joyous animation, and only now and then did a slight wrinkle, with a barely discernible line furrowing her Grecian forehead, sink itself and cast on her face an expression of weariness, or the corners of her lips, still red and shapely, drop downward and make that oval, white, delicate face 10 years older than it seemed to be usually. But those were only short and rare moments, after which Malvina Darvid was again entirely flooded with the brilliancy of her beautiful eyes, her splendid toilet, the sounds of her metallic voice, warm and full of sweetness. She seemed barely a few years older than her elder daughter. Sometimes guests left her box with the words, "She is more beautiful than her daughter," and oftener still, "She is more charming and sympathetic than her daughter." Still, nature had been no stepmother to Irene Darvid, but life, though so short thus far, had stamped on her exterior a mark which, while it astonished and discouraged, repelled. If the younger sister seemed a living portrait of her mother, the elder recalled her father, with her high forehead, thin lips, and, a thing wonderful at such a tender age, the mark of irony drawn over them. Her hair, too, like her father's, changed with fiery gleams of gold and bronze, while the pale complexion of her face, which was too long, was lighted by the frequent sharp glitter of her eyes, which, as those of her father, were not large, and had gray pupils with a cold glance, penetrating and reasoning. Her shapely form was somewhat too slender, her posture and movements too stiff and ceremonious. She passed in society for a haughty, cold, unapproachable, original, and even eccentric young lady. On the stage was presented a play which had been preceded by immense praise. In the theater had collected all that bore the name of high and fashionable society in the city. The boxes were filled, except one, which only just before the beginning of the second act was opened with a rattle and filled with loud, free, and bold conversation. It was occupied by a number of young men of elegant dress and manners. They, as it seemed, were connected by similarity in position, habits, and pleasures. From the higher to the lower rows of the theater, all eyes and glasses were turned toward that box, with its princes, young nabobs, sons of ancient families, or heirs to immense fortunes. Through boxes, armchairs, galleries, passed names notorious through deeds of originality, witty sayings, astonishing excesses, names interwoven with anecdotes about money and love passages. The substance of the love passages could be repeated only in whispers, while the amounts of money were mentioned with eyes widely opened in amazement. Two among these young men occupied public attention beyond others that winter, Baron Emil Blauendorf and Marion Darvid, both of families recently, but greatly, enriched. The Blauendorf house was older by some generations, and had become widely connected. On the other hand, their fortune in possession of the present descendant was vanishing quickly. In comparison with the entirely new edifice of the Darvids, it seemed a ruin. On these two general attention was concentrated with the greatest curiosity, For during that winter and the preceding one, the most numerous anecdotes touching them were in circulation among those who frequented that theatre. They were so young, and still so noted. But Baron Emil was considerably older than Marion. He was 30 and little favored in looks. Small, weakly, with red, closely cut hair, with features which were too small and injured by a faded complexion, with small eyes, which, because of nearsightedness, were either covered with eyeglasses or blinked at the light from behind yellow lids, which gave them an expression of pride and wariness. An unshapely exterior, unimposing, slight, bent, sickly. But through those small, yellowish, thin hands had passed already the fortune of the old baron, who was dead some years, and now a second fortune was passing through them, a fortune left scarcely a year before to her son by the baroness, who was famous for her idolatrous love of him. People looked and wondered how such a great river of gold could flow through a creature so small and insignificant. With Marion it was different. He astonished also, but he roused general sympathy. Such a child, and such a perfectly beautiful fellow at the same time. He was not 23 years of age yet, of fine stature. His manners were elegant and pleasing. He had the head of a cherub with bright curling locks, a noble fresh face from which gazed eyes as blue as turquoise, and wise, too wise perhaps, in so youthful a countenance, for these eyes seemed not to confide but to jeer, or to be wearied in seeking something through the world without finding it. Women whispered into one another's ears that lad, when in England, had joined the Salvation Army, but after he had remained a short time in its ranks, he became in Paris a member of the Hashish Club, and brought away the habit of using narcotics to rouse dreams in himself and unusual conditions. If the city at that moment had temporary possession of Bianca Bianetti, it was thanks to that lad, who, in a remote land, had won the heart of the singer. Some insisted that he had spent fabulous sums on her. Others contradicted, declaring that not Bianca, the singer, had consumed them, but Aurora, that noted Amazon of the circus, for whose favor princes of blood royal had striven in various capitals. That shapely little nabob had come, seen, and conquered, and when he had got his prize at an incredible outlay, he threw it aside and brought home Bianca. But is that all that may be told of him? He and Baron Emil are fountains of histories of this sort. The baron is considerably older, but this lad has a father. That father himself is a source of unbounded credit. Young Darvid has as many debts as there are golden curls on that cherub head of his. What will his papa say? What? Not long since that papa returned from the ends of the earth, after a long absence. Will he put an end to the tricks of the boy? Will he be able to do so? The white forehead of the youth has an expression of maturity, and at times of something else, namely weariness, and in his blue eyes gleams of firmness, resolve, and contempt. He looks as if he despised the whole world then. He and the baron occupy themselves much with art and literature. They expend almost as much on art as on women and joyous suppers. They are highly cultured. The baron plays like an artist. Marion translates poetry into various languages. In the box were a number of others resembling these two, but the others had places elsewhere in the theatre. They had come for a brief time and left the box afterward. Then there remained only the baron and young Darvid. Behind their chairs sat some third man, very quietly, as if to attract the least attention possible. This was Pan Arthur Kranitsky. People were accustomed to see him here and elsewhere with these two young men, and with others also, but with these two most frequently. His hair curled, freshened, his black mustache pointed at the ends above his red lips, in the fashion of young men. But today he looks considerably more retiring and older than usual. With much bold conversation, with laughter which cast his head back, with movements full of grace and animation, he generally strove to equal, and did equal, those two young nabobs, whose mentor he seemed to be, and at the same time their comrade and continual guest, as well as their gracious protector. This time he was weighed down and gloomy, with spots on his aged forehead. He was sitting in a corner of the box, turning his attention neither to the play nor the audience, and what was more, not striving to attract the attention of anyone. But from behind the shoulders of the young men in the front of the box, his hand, as if directed by an irresistible impulse, turned the opera glass, from moment to moment, toward Malvina Darvid. He felt that he ought not to look so persistently at that woman with the gleaming star above her forehead, so he dropped his hand to raise it again and turn it in the same direction. As if imitating Krenitsky, though really he did not even think of his existence, Baron Emil was acting in the same way with reference to Irene, gazing through his opera glass at her face, which showed indifference and even weariness. He did this with a perfect disregard for the rest of the audience, and beginning at the second act with an insolence which might have confused or angered another woman. But Irene, indifferent for some time, raised her glass also, and turned it on the Baron. With these glasses, the two people brought their faces near each other. They looked each other straight in the eyes, separated themselves from the audience, and gazed from the height of their two boxes in full disregard of everything happening around them. These two opera glasses, planted in permanent opposition, attract the attention of all. But Irene and the Baron do not heed that, do not care to know anything whatever about the audience, or the love scenes and tragedy represented in that theater. They gaze long at each other with such indifference that one might ask, why do they do that? Perhaps because it is original, perhaps to rouse the curiosity or the censure of the audience. But after a long time, there appeared on their faces a jeering, self-willed smile, with a tinge of friendly comradeship, mixed in the Baron's case with a passing gleam of the eyes, and in Irene's a pale flush, which covered her lofty forehead for a moment and then vanished. Dropping his hand with the opera glass, the Baron turned to Marion. "Très garconnière, sir," said he. "She is bold and looks down on everything. She is disenchanted. Un désabusé. Very interesting, and grows more and more so." "Does she rouse a new shiver in you?" laughed Marion. "Yes, an entirely new shiver. That is a type of woman which is barely beginning. 20 years old, and a perfectly distinct individuality. 20 years old, and knows painted pots thoroughly." "That is a family trait with us," retorted Marion. "Your mother," continued the Baron, "has undying beauty, such splendid hair and eyes, but hers is another type entirely." "A past one," put in Marion. "Yes, that is true, a past type, a simple one, but Panna Irene is new and intricate. Yes, that is the word, intricate. We are all intricate now, full of contrasts, dissonances, and vexations." In the theater a thunder of applause was heard. The two young men looked at each other and laughed almost loudly. "What are they playing?" asked the Baron, indicating the stage with his head. "Ma foi, I have not heard one word." "Well, old man," said Marion, turning to Krenitsky, "what are they doing on the stage?" Krenitsky dropped his hand with the opera glass quickly and blurted out, "What is the question, Marion?" His eyes, which were fine yet in their prolonged lids, were glazed with a tear. "Ho, ho, romantic, there is a tear in your eye. The subject must be affecting. Let us listen." They began to listen, but quite differently from others. When passions exhibited on the stage quickened the beating of all hearts, or poetry, pulsating in lofty words, brightened faces with enthusiasm, Marion and the Baron laughed inattentively and with contempt. When stupidity, selfishness, or wit called out laughter or ridicule, they were immovable in cold importance, puffed up and insolent. When the curtain came down at the end, and a deafening, prolonged thunder of applause was heard, their hands rested ostentatiously on the edge of the box. This opposition to the impressions and opinions of the audience might seem a childish wish for distinction, but one could feel besides in it a bold throwing down of the gauntlet to common taste, and an estimate of the various elements and values in life directly in conflict with that of others. Toward the end of the last act, Krenitsky entered Malvina Darvid's box, and saluting each woman silently, he stood motionless. Malvina bowed toward him slightly, then a shadow came out on her face. This shadow seemed to have torn itself from an internal cloud. She frowned, a deep wrinkle appeared on her forehead, the corners of her mouth drooped somewhat, and her face, with that brilliant star and the aureole of bright hair above, had an expression of pain when seen on the drapery of the box as a background. But that did not last long. The box was filled with an assembly of brilliant and agreeable men, one of whom, with his gray hair and bearing of an official, made a low obeisance before the wife of Darvid, and seemed to lay at her feet smiles full of homage. Hence she grew affable, pleasant, vivacious, elegant in gestures, and in the modulation of her beautiful voice she answered politeness with politeness, requests with promises, and gave opinions in return for questions touching the piece just played. Baron Emil meanwhile approached Irene and, indicating the excited audience with his eyes, inquired, "How do those shouting Arcadians please you?" Taking on her shoulders the wrap which he held for her, she answered, "They are happy." "Why?" "Because they are naive." "You have described the position famously," cried he with enthusiasm. "Only Arcadians could be so happy. As to believe in those painted pots, as their great-grandfathers did," added he. "Who knows," said she as it were with deep thought, "whether the great-grandfathers really believed in them or only pretended belief? Ha, ha, ha! Beyond price! Excellent! How you and I converse, do we not? This is harmony. Not without dissonance. Yes, yes, not without vexation, but that is nothing. That even rouses." During this interchange of opinions, which was like the glitter of cold and sharp steel, Kranitsky in the crowd which surrounded Malvina was able to whisper to her, "Tomorrow at 11. Without looking at him, and with a quiver of her brows, which drooped a little, she answered, "It is too early." "Absolutely necessary. A catastrophe. A misfortune," whispered he in addition. She raised to him a glance which showed that she was tortured to her inmost soul by fear, but at the same moment Marion gave her his arm, and said, "To be original, to edify the Arcadians, and to give myself pleasure, I shall be today a virtuous son, conducting his own beautiful mamma downstairs." Adroit, with almost childish delight in his blue eyes, but with a sarcastic smile which seemed to have grown to his lips, which were shaded by a minute mustache, this youth led through the theater corridor that woman not young, but whose beautiful and original head and whose rich toilet drew all eyes to her. "I am proud of you, dear mamma. Today I have heard whole odes sung in your honor. Even Emile declares that you are eclipsing Irene with your beauty." She was smiling and also angry. Her dark gleaming eyes rose with love to the shapely face of her son, but, striving to be dignified, she said, "Marianne, you know that I am displeased at hearing you talk to me in such a tone." He laughed loudly. "Then, my dear mamma, you should grow old as quickly as possible, put on a cap, and sit in a jacket at the fireplace. I should be filled then with timid respect, and would hurry away with all speed from such an annoying mamma. But since I am not annoying you, will be good and come home with us. We shall drink tea together." "Au désespoir, chère maman, but that cannot be. The rest of this day or night I have promised to friends." "Is today the only time promised?" asked she with a shade of sadness. "For the true sage, tomorrow and yesterday have no existence," answered Marion. They were at the open door of the carriage. Marion bent and kissed his mother's hand. "Be not angry, mamma dear, but you are never angry. If there is anything on earth that I worship, yet it is your marvelous sweetness of temper." "It is excessive," answered Malvina. "If I only knew how to dominate." He interrupted her with a laugh. "I should avoid you in that ease, but now all relations between us are excellent, though they are constitutional or even republican." "I go for anarchy," put in Baron Emil, helping Irene to a seat in the carriage. He spoke somewhat through his nose and teeth. It was difficult to say whether by nature or habit, but that gave to his speech a character of contemptuousness and indolence. "But of dissonances tomorrow, n'est-ce pas?" asked he. "And of vexations," concluded Irene with a smile, wherewith her hand remained on the Baron's palm a few seconds longer than was necessary. Soon after, Malvina Darvid was sitting at a small table covered with a tea service, in a study which was like the lined and gilded interior of a costly confectionery box. Massive silver, artistically finished, expensive porcelain, exquisite tidbits, enticing the eye by their ornamentation, and the taste by the odor from them, tempered, however, by the strong fragrance of hyacinths, syringa, and violets which were blooming at the window and the walls, and on large and small tables everywhere. Remember to subscribe.